All right, everybody, welcome back. So, in our last module, module 7.2, we discussed the diversity of animals and how we classify and categorize different types of animals as ecologists and evolutionary biologists. So, today we're going to be covering uh, the other important clades in the family Eukarya. And specifically, we're going to be looking at protists and fungi. Um, and again, we're still in the broad family of Eukarya, where we're looking at organisms with cells characterized by membrane enclosed nucleus and organelles. But now we're going to be understanding what distinguishes these two sort of lesser known in terms of just general knowledge um, in the family Eukarya, protists and fungi. So the first one we're going to discuss about is fungi. Um, so when we think of fungi, you probably go immediately to fungus and think about mushrooms. And that's certainly true. But how do we sort of think about them in terms of organization and as biologists? So fungus are interesting in that they can be both unicellular or multicellular. Again, it's a eukaryotic organism, but it maintains its nutrients by secreting digestive enzymes onto organic matter and then absorbing it. And because it has this unique digestive method, they're all characterized as decomposers. So they digest and use organic molecules in dead organisms as sources of nutrients and energy. And so when we think about the structure of fungi, we think that we know that they are composed of these thread-like structure called hyphae, singular hypha. A hypha is basically a chain of many cells that are capable of absorbing those nutrients. And when these hyphae interweave, they form something that we call a mycelium. And that is how we categorize the structure of fungi. So when you think of fungi, you probably immediately think about mushrooms, but it's a much broader classification of, of eukarya than that. It includes molds and it includes things like yeast as well. So what is made to make bread, for example, is in fact a fungus. And in terms of nutrition, there are certainly lots of fungi that are really important for for nutrition generally, but they're most important uh, for their decomposing properties, and ultimately are sort of cornerstones of a lot of different ecosystems. Your book has an excellent example of looking at all the different types of fungi that might be present in these dense forested environments. So you can have things that are mushrooms that grow on trees, grow on the earth, hyphae that make up these mycelium that actually can form symbiotic relationships with the soil and the trees. And then you can have very different types of molds, and these molds um, can again they can act as decomposers, and they can also act as symbiotic relationship with many of these different trees. Um, and they may also produce these yeasts, and these yeasts can be important in terms of creating protective biofilms on a lot of these different types of plants. So when we think about fungi, it's a lot more than just mushrooms. It's ultimately sort of the cornerstone of decomposers within an ecosystem. So I'm going to have you watch a couple videos looking more specifically at fungi and protists. So I'm going to sort of just give you the general overview of what distinguishes these characteristics, and then more specifically, I'll have you refer to those other videos. Um, but probably what I think is actually one of the most interesting branches of life is actually going to looking at protists. Um, in the family Eukarya. So what are protists? These are probably, when you're talking to somebody, can you please explain what a protist is? You're probably going to get some strange answers. Ultimately, it's a eukaryote that really can't be classified as a plant, animal, or fungus, but they might have characteristics of some or all of those different of those different clades. They're usually unicellular, although there's some exceptions to that. And some are heterotrophic, but some are in fact autotrophic. So again, we have sort of this mishmash of different organisms that are lumped generally into this clade Protista. So your book does a good job of talking about a couple of these interesting different ones. Like, for example, there's a slime mold. And ultimately, when you sort of think about slime mold, you think fungus, but um, but it has, sorry. But unlike fungus, the way that they ingest the food is very different. And so ultimately, it's classified as a protist. Um, and then there are things that are sort of animals, but are not like animals. And then there are plant like things. You can have algae which float in lakes and perform photosynthesis. Um, however, the way that um, they're structured ultimately doesn't fit into the plant like clades. So again, it's a bit of a mismatch of different types of organisms. Um, and interestingly, protists often are a major cause of parasitic disease. For example, malaria is actually a parasite, and that parasite is actually a protist. Same with organisms like Giardia um, or Cryptosporidium, for example, uh, two pathogens that are important um, for waterborne disease. And again, you can see how varied the structure of protists can be. They can be unicellular or multicellular. They can have sort of like these flagella and look and be able to sort of move uh, very animal-like. But when you look at like these slime molds, their physiology, you would think, well, because they're acting as a decomposer, they're more likely to be a fungi. But ultimately, um, they're not. The idea is protists are often animal-like, plant-like, or fungus-like, but ultimately are not do not possess enough of the characteristics to really be considered a plant, fungi, or animal. And again, ultimately, what is going to determine the relatedness of these organisms is their genetic material, not necessarily um, their body makeup, but ultimately their genetics and how interrelated these organisms are. So let's go through a summary of sort of what we've covered in these modules. So we know that the domain Eukarya comprises all eukaryotic organisms. It contains plants, animals, fungi, and many types of produce. We learned that plants are multicellular eukaryotes that photosynthesize and are adaptive to living on land and have cell walls. Animals are multicellular eukaryotic heterotrophs that obtain nutrients by ingestion, and they contain invertebrates and vertebrates, and generally um, have differing bodily structures that can be broadly categorized into radial no symmetry and bilateral symmetry. And then we have Fungi. Now, primarily, fungi are decomposers. They acquire their nutrition by breaking down dead organic matter. And lastly, we have protists, which are a really diverse group of mostly unicellular eukaryotic organisms that do not cluster on a single branch of the evolutionary tree, but are fairly diverse throughout it. Again, you've got to think back to the genetics of the organisms, not just the physical structure of those organisms. Okay, I have a couple extra videos for you to look at the differences between fungi and protists and understanding some of the facts of life or tree of life structures. Additionally, make sure that you watch the video for the guest lecture series. Again, that will be a question on your test. So make sure you watch that and are able to say what the main topic of the talk was about and one thing that you learned from the talk. All right, get up, have a glass of water, take a few minutes to breathe, and good luck on the quiz for this section. Okay, see you soon.